Chapter 9. Can I get married again? A valid divorce implies the right to marry. We have seen that Jesus and Paul condemned easy, groundless divorces, but what did they say about remarriage? This is a very difficult issue for Christians, mainly because the New Testament says so little. Jesus appeared to condemn remarriage, though we saw in chapter 5 he was condemning it only after an invalid divorce. Paul is virtually silent on the issue, but there are two good reasons for believing that he allowed remarriage. First, we will see that everyone in the first century believed that divorcees could remarry. In fact, most people thought that they should remarry, and Paul says nothing to counter this belief. Second, we will see that while Paul does not say divorcees can remarry, some of his teaching is based on the assumption that they can. Mary and Joseph's divorce certificate. Did you know that we have found a divorce certificate of Mary and Joseph? It is dated AD 72, so it was not the Mary and Joseph, who would have been about 100 years old by that date. Mary was the most popular female name of the time, and Joseph was the second most popular male name, so it was likely that there were an awful lot of couples called Mary and Joseph. This particular couple was among a handful of Jews who were living on Masada during the final war against the Romans. Masada was an impregnable fortress built by Herod the Great on top of a high, rocky outcrop that was surrounded by steep sides. The only access was by a single, very steep and easily defended path. So Herod made a safe and very comfortable haven for himself and a few privileged individuals. He had huge food stores and underground water cisterns the size of large basements. There were buildings for his servants and a beautifully decorated palace for himself. He even had a luxurious bathhouse with an underfloor heating system. When he died, the Romans left a small garrison there but did not develop it in any way. In AD 66, the Romans invaded Palestine to put down a Jewish revolt. They besieged Jerusalem and eventually destroyed it in AD 70, but some Jews had the foresight to capture Masada and fortify it against the Roman invasion. They managed to defend Masada till AD 73, when the Romans finished the huge task of building an artificial slope against one of the sheer cliff sides of the fortress and then rolled their tall war engines up to the walls. In the fortress, the Romans found not just soldiers, but whole families, who all killed themselves to avoid being captured. Men, women, and children. The Jews had converted the fortress into a small village and had filled the food stores, adapted one of the buildings into a synagogue with a school, and used a wall tower for a bakery. They had settled down and lived there in as normal a way as possible, within the constraints of being under siege by the Romans. People got married there, had children there, and even got divorced there. We know this because some of them hid their most valuable documents, and among these was the divorce certificate of Joseph and Mary, dated AD 72. You are free to marry any man you wish. The ancient document followed the traditional wording, including the only words that were compulsory in a Jewish divorce certificate: you are free to marry any Jewish man you wish. Similar words are also found in many Greek certificates and convey the legal principle that the reason a divorce certificate was given to a woman was to enable her to remarry. Everyone in the first century, so far as we know, agreed that a divorcee had the right to remarry. The Romans had this right enshrined in their law, and they certainly did not want to introduce any restriction to it. And as far as we know, there were no Jewish parties in the first century that prohibited remarriage after divorce. What the Dead Sea Scrolls really say. In the past, some scholars thought that the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls disapproved of remarriage because one of the first of the scrolls to be discovered, the Damascus document, appeared to say you should not get married a second time. The scrolls of the community at Qumran were discovered in 1947 by an Arab boy looking for treasure. He was deliberately throwing stones into a cave high up in a cliff, and the sound of breaking pottery was exactly what he was hoping to hear. He did not climb up to it himself because he was afraid that the treasure might be protected by a jinn, or genie, who had been released when he broke the pot. So he enlisted the help of his brother and a friend by pretending that they were better climbers than he. He said that he would wait at the bottom, ready to run for help if there were a jinn. The boys were most disappointed when they found nothing more than crumbling documents, but they managed to sell a large scroll to an antique dealer in the market for a few dollars. This dealer recognized that it was a scroll of Isaiah, so he showed it to an Orthodox priest who bought it for $70. Realizing that it was an ancient script, the priest sold it later for $1 million, which shows the value of learning ancient Hebrew. Among the scrolls, the text called the Damascus document describes how a group of Jews deliberately chose to live in the desert to get away from a corrupt priesthood and from other Jews who they believed did not follow God's law properly. One of the things they criticized was the practice of having more than one wife at a time. Like Jesus, they said that God's plan for marriage was for it to be between one man and one woman. But early scholars misunderstood this passage and thought that the Qumran Jews were criticizing divorce and remarriage. We now know that this was wrong, because other scrolls showed that this community allowed divorce. It has become clear that the Damascus document was criticizing polygamy rather than remarriage, though some older books still repeat the early misunderstanding of this text. The Jews at Qumran, like all other Jews, regarded remarriage as the right of any divorcee. Everyone expected divorcees to remarry. Actually, both Jews and Romans in the 1st century thought that most divorcees should remarry. A Roman citizen who did not get remarried within 18 months of a divorce, or within 2 years if their partner had died, could be prosecuted under a law that was enacted by Emperor Augustus in 18 BC. Augustus was concerned that many young men were avoiding marriage by divorcing the brides their parents had arranged for them to marry and then living carefree, licentious lives. He was also concerned that there would not be enough children being born to Roman citizens, so he wanted these young men to get remarried and father children. For their part, Jews thought that divorcees, especially childless ones, should remarry, because they had not yet obeyed the command, "Be fruitful and multiply." They believed it was the duty of every Jewish man to father at least 2 children in order to fulfill this command, and if he had not done so before he was divorced or widowed, he was expected to remarry. Remarriages for divorcees in the 1st century was therefore the norm. If they did not remarry, they were contravening the secular or religious law, and they all knew they had the right to remarry because it was written into their divorce certificate, "You may marry any man you wish." Paul quotes a divorce certificate. These words, which were so well known from the Jewish and Greco-Roman divorce certificates, are found in the New Testament, where Paul quotes a Christian version of them. "She is free to be married whom she wishes, only in the Lord." 1 Corinthians 7:39. When Jews wrote out their divorce certificates, they usually added the word Jewish, so that the words became, "You may marry any Jewish man you wish." This reminded the ex-wife that she should remarry only within the faith. Paul makes a similar addition by telling Christian widows they may remarry only in the Lord, that is, a Christian man. We do not know if Paul was converting the Jewish formula into a Christian one, or whether he was quoting a traditional Christian version, but either way, it would be very odd to quote these words if Christians disapproved altogether of remarriage after divorce. It seems strange at first that Paul uses this phrase in verse 39, where he is speaking to widows and not to divorcees, but as we saw in chapter 7, it is because he wants to assure Christian widows that they do not need to follow the Jewish law of levirate marriage, which makes them marry their brother-in-law if they are childless. Paul argues that a widow has the same rights as a divorcee. If a divorcee can marry whomever she wishes, then a widow has the same right. The interesting thing for us is that Paul's reasoning works only if you believe that divorcees do have the right to remarry. It would be no good assuring the widows that they had the same right as divorcees to remarry anyone they wished, if divorcees were not in fact allowed to remarry. Paul was therefore assuming in this passage that his readers believed divorcees did have the right to remarry. Paul says abandoned believers can remarry. The only place where Paul specifically speaks about remarriage for a divorcee is when he addresses the believer who has been abandoned by their partner. We saw in chapter 6 that separation was equivalent to divorce in Roman law, so that when someone was abandoned by their partner or was asked to leave their partner's house, they were being divorced. Paul was totally against this Roman groundless divorce by separation, just as Jesus was against the Jewish groundless divorce, and Paul told Christians who had separated from their partners that they should try to undo this divorce by attempting a reconciliation and remaining unmarried while they were doing so. 1 Corinthians 7:11. But what if a believer was the victim of a Roman divorce by separation? We saw that Paul told them they were not enslaved, 1 Corinthians 7:15. Some people interpret not enslaved as meaning no longer tied to your partner, that is, you can live apart but you cannot divorce, while others interpret it as no longer tied to your marriage, that is, you can get divorced but not remarry. Both these interpretations would have sounded like nonsense to a first-century reader, because Paul was speaking to people who were already divorced, so they had no choice in the matter. It was no good telling them that they could live apart because this was already forced on them. And it was no good telling them that they could get divorced because, as far as Roman law was concerned, they were already divorced. A first-century reader of Paul's letter would have had no doubt about what not enslaved meant, because it would remind them about the words on their divorce certificate, "You are now free to marry." Even if they did not have a divorce certificate, because many Roman divorces took place without an actual certificate, they would still have had this right under Roman law. Paul would have been understood to be saying very clearly, you are no longer enslaved. You are free from that marriage, and, as any divorce certificate says, free to remarry. Paul granted this freedom to believers who were separated because their unbelieving partner had deserted them, but not to believers who had separated in such a way from their partner. He did not approve of the groundless divorce, and if the believers had done the separating, he urged them to attempt reconciliation with their partners. 1 Corinthians 7:11. However, when people were the victims of Roman divorce by separation, they were powerless to reverse the situation, so Paul allowed them to regard their divorce as invalid. Abandonment is neglect. What is Paul's justification for regarding this type of divorce as valid for the victim? On the face of it, he is being inconsistent. He is saying on the one hand that divorce by separation is an invalid form of divorce, but on the other hand, he allows the victim to remarry, which implies that he does think it is valid. There are two possible answers. He is being either legalistic or pragmatic. Paul could be pointing out that the victims have been deserted, and as we have seen under Jewish law, they would then have a right to divorce because they were suffering neglect, as defined in Exodus 21:10-11. Their partner was failing to provide food, clothing, and conjugal love. It is likely that this was in Paul's mind, because speaking about being enslaved is a little strange in the context of marriage, but it is natural when speaking about Exodus 21:10, which originally concerned slavery. Strictly speaking, although it is true that the victim had grounds for a biblical divorce, neglect, the divorce had not been properly processed according to Jewish custom. However, Paul may have been stating a practical solution that was fair to the victim even if it wasn't legally watertight. We have a very clear indication that Paul was thinking in this pragmatic way because he uses the phrase, God has called you to peace. This is similar to the rabbinic legal phrase, for the sake of peace, used by the courts when they gave a pragmatic solution in a case where a strict application of the law would be unfair. For example, strictly speaking, children could not be liable for theft, but leaving it at that would mean that children could take and keep anything they found. The rabbinic courts decided that this was stealing, though it would go without punishment. They could not justify this in strictly legal terms, so they made a ruling that was practical and fair. They said, we do this for the sake of peace. Paul is saying the same thing, though he says this is God's ruling. God has called you to peace. Paul probably based his decision on both pragmatism and the application of the law of divorce for neglect. Either way, his decision makes good common sense that is fair to the victim without approving of divorce by separation. Even the guilty partner can remarry, eventually. Paul allows the victims of a groundless divorce to get remarried, but what about the people who carried out these divorces? Can they ever get remarried? On the face of it, the answer is no, or at least not for some time. That is because Paul gives very clear instructions in 1 Corinthians 7:11 that the people who have separated from their partners must remain unmarried and attempt to be reconciled with the people whom they have divorced. Paul does not say how long someone should continue to remain unmarried and attempt reconciliation, and many interpreters assume that this person may never remarry. However, Paul's instruction is not a punishment, but an attempt to help the victim of that divorce. He is telling the people who forced their partners into an unwarranted divorce that they should try to put things right by giving their ex-partners the opportunity to continue the marriage, or, strictly speaking, to remarry them. This implies that when it is no longer possible to reverse the mistake, the command is no longer in force, because it can no longer be carried out. If the divorced partner marries someone else or rejects all attempts at reconciliation, then we can assume that the person can stop trying for reconciliation and can remarry. It would certainly be strange if the command not to remarry were a punishment for groundless divorce, for this would make it into an unforgivable sin, and we know there is only one of these, Matthew 12:31. One might argue that the inability to remarry is a consequence, but not a punishment, because the former marriage is still carrying on in some spiritual way or in God's eyes. This reasoning works only if no one can remarry after a divorce, because if the wronged partner can remarry, as I have concluded in this book, then the marriage is over. We saw in chapter 7 that the concept that only death can end a marriage is not scriptural and is based on a misunderstanding of a few texts. Therefore, the command that the guilty partners should avoid remarriage is not a consequent or a punishment, but a practical way for them to try to reverse their mistake. And the command lasts only as long as this might still be possible. In practice, few people who divorce others against their will would bother to obey this command, unless, like these Corinthians, they were convicted that they had done something wrong soon after the divorce. But what if they were convicted of the error long after they had divorced, when one or both of the former spouses had already remarried? Should they attempt to divorce their new partners in order to be reconciled and remarry their original partners? We will look at this in the next chapter. Conclusion. Paul allows remarriage. I am sure that if Paul had told Christians that they should never remarry, they would have obeyed, even though it would have meant breaking the Roman law and putting them in danger of prosecution, and even if they did not yet have any children, so that they were also breaking the Jewish laws of piety. Just as some of them were willing to face lions and torturers because they refused to say, "Caesar is Lord," I am sure they would have been willing to break the laws that commanded remarriage if Paul had told them to do so. We have seen in previous chapters that Jesus and Paul told only those who had invalid divorces to avoid remarriage, which implies that those who had valid divorces were allowed to remarry. In this chapter, we found that Paul's teaching assumes that divorcees can remarry, but we are still left with the fact that Jesus and Paul did not specifically say that divorcees may remarry. Can we safely assume that they can, simply based on this silence? Silence on this issue is not strange. Actually, it would be strange if Paul made a pronouncement that divorcees were allowed to remarry, because the question never arose in the first century. It would be like saying married women may have children, or a married couple may sleep in the same bed. There was no need to say them because these things inhered in the nature and purpose of marriage. There was even less reason to say a divorcee may remarry, because not only was the right of remarriage regarded as part of the very nature of divorce, but divorcees had a legal certificate that said precisely this. If we said that Paul's silence means that he condemned remarriage, then we would also have to assume that his silence condemned breastfeeding by Christians, or celebrating birthdays, or adopting children, or any number of things that were considered normal activities by everyone in the ancient world. We therefore have to conclude that Paul allowed validly divorced believers to remarry. If they had initiated the invalid Roman divorce by separation, he tells them they should not remarry, but try to reverse the divorce instead. But if they were victims of this kind of divorce, they could not do anything to reverse it, so they could regard it as valid divorce based on neglect. Paul even quoted the words of the divorce certificate with approval, and his words, "not enslaved," would be unambiguous to a first-century reader. His teaching on remarriage is admittedly ambiguous to modern readers, and we will look in chapter 12 at the reasons why our perception has changed so dramatically. Before that, however, we have to look at the difficult situation of those who have divorced, but cannot say that their divorce was based on biblical grounds.